Do you want your business to grow faster? Are you open to new and out-of-the-box ways to drive revenues and increase value? How do you imagine the most successful entrepreneurs and business leaders double, triple, or expand their businesses tenfold or more? The answer is deals. This is a weekly podcast featuring conversations with business owners, executives, and leaders as we reveal behind-the-scenes details that give you, our listeners, the confidence to pursue your own deal-driven growth. On this show, we discuss a huge variety of deals, everything from large, complex mergers and acquisitions, capital raising, joint ventures, strategic alliances, real estate, affiliate and sponsorship deals, franchising, and more. My name is Corey Kupfer, and I've been supporting deal-driven growth for businesses for over 35 years as a successful entrepreneur, professional negotiator, and attorney. My goal is to help you strategize, plan for, find, and complete deals that will help your company grow faster. Welcome to the Deal Quest podcast. Let's get started. Georgi Feidler is a seasoned leader with 20 plus years of experience spanning global, multi-site, and multi-state operations across Fortune 500, healthcare, CPG, technology, SaaS, and startups. She's played a pivotal role in IPOs, mergers, acquisitions, capital raises, and scaling companies from small teams to organizations with over 68,000 employees. With a strategic yet hands-on approach, Georgi partners with founders, CEOs, COOs, and executive teams to align people, process, and systems with the company's vision. She thrives in high-growth environments, leveraging data-driven decision-making to fuel sustainable business success. She also works a lot with boomers, and I relate to that because I'm at the very end of the baby boom generation, so in the very end of that big gap, and to help them transition out of their companies, ensuring a smooth succession plan that allows them to retire early while preserving their legacy and business continuity. Georgi, welcome to the Deal Quest podcast.
Thank you, Corey. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, listen, I'm super excited. I mean, you've got, such a background. People could, have no doubt from the bio why I'm having you on the show on a Deals podcast. But before we get into all your experience and how you work with boomers and, how you came to that and, multi-state and the international, all that stuff, I want to take you back to when you were a little kid growing up, maybe 10, 12 years old. What did you want to be? Because I'm guessing, at that stage, working with boomers to help them transition their business probably wasn't on the radar, but maybe I'm wrong. You tell me.
No, not at all. I probably didn't even know what boomers were back then. I don't think that generation was even defined yet. But yeah, I wanted to be a pediatrician when I was younger. That lasted until about the age of 12 when my nephew fell off a chair and cracked his head open and there was blood everywhere and I started vomiting. I pretty much knew then that maybe medical field was not going to be the place for me. But yeah, my pediatrician was my hero because my parents early on, they were kind of, it was hers, like the Brady Bunch, and then I'm ours, right, from my parents. And they were rebuilding their life. They were on access. And I started to turn like yellowish orange when I was about 5 months old.
Wow.
And they were concerned. So they took me into this access doctor who said, oh, I think this might be serious. She might have leukemia. We're going to need to take 1.5 pints of blood from her. And just think about that for a second. 1.5 pints of blood from a 5-month-old baby. Not a great idea. I think we only have like 3 pints as a baby. But yeah, my parents were a little nervous about that. When the nurse said she couldn't do it, they thought, oh, we better go get a second opinion. So they scraped up the money and went to a pediatrician, Dr. Brown. And he said, there's nothing wrong with this child. She's just eating too many carrots. And so he saved my life. Right?
Oh my God.
And I grew up hearing that story and I thought, oh, what an honorable profession and getting to be around babies and save babies' lives. It just seems so noble to me. So I was all about being a pediatrician until about 12, realized I couldn't stand the sight of blood and then thought, oh, okay, if not a doctor, maybe a lawyer then. I do love to argue and, that sounds like I can help some people maybe on the other end. And that was my goal all the way through high school and into college. And then I spent a summer dock clerking for an attorney's office and I saw their lives and I thought, ugh, I don't want that. And so I switched again to having no idea.
I love it. It's so fun. I mean, it raises some things for me. My mother was a critical care nurse growing up. And, like as a teenager, whatever it was, I'd have to go to the hospital. She was like a head nurse. She was in CCU, ICU, like critical care units. And I hated it. Like if I had to go get the car keys or get some money from mom or whatever, and I had to go to the hospital, like it was just so not my environment. I didn't understand how she could work there all the time. It was definitely not my thing. So I relate to that. And frankly, I also relate, despite the fact that I am a lawyer and I love what I do, I also relate to the lawyer thing because, frankly, so many lawyers are unhappy. And when I was in big law, which they didn't even call it that back then, now they call it big law. But, it's one of the reasons why I opened my own firm at 30 years old with no clients, because I looked at the lives of the partners at the big firms in New York City. And I'm like, wait, that's what I'm aspiring to? These folks that still work their lives away, they make more money than they can spend, sure, but most of them are divorced or they don't see their kids or they're whatever it is, and I'm like, that's not for me. So yeah.
No time to spend the money that they're making, right?
Exactly. So one other question looking back, and then maybe this will just have to fill the gap from where you left off, but what was your first deal of any type that you can remember, whether it was something while you were young or early in your career, anything that you consider a deal?
Yes. So early on, my career kind of took a very winding road. Even in the later stages, a lot of people, they finally get a job, right, and they get selected in a career, and then they kind of go deep, right? They just get the next job and the next job because they have that background, and that's kind of where they hang around. I feel very fortunate that mine didn't take that route at all. Definitely consider myself more of a generalist, T-shaped, right? Deep in a couple of areas, but really widespread because I got to spend time in my career in, recruiting, and they called it personnel back then. So it was a little bit ago. And then moving into business office and finance, accounts payable, accounts receivable, revenue, labor, expense tracking, payroll. I was still, young and just out of college. And, you want to make money when you're in your 20s, right? And I quickly realized that the money was not in the operations and finance side of things. I realized it was in sales. And so off I went. And I spent about 8.5 years in sales and marketing and business development in healthcare. And so one of my jobs there, after I spent about a year in the nonprofit space, and I realized, oh, this is not for me at all. I love to advise nonprofits and be on boards. I can't work for nonprofits. I think I'm too much for them, right? I got called pushy a lot, I remember, when I worked for a nonprofit. So the next gig was in senior living. And when I started there were about 4,800 employees. So still pretty good size. And then over a period of just over 3 years, we grew to 68,000 employees through a series of mergers and acquisitions. And that turned what's traditionally healthcare, a very corporate, red tape, slow moving, bureaucratic type of environment into an exciting, fast paced, what's next type of environment, which I just loved. I really thrived in that. And I was lucky to be located in Arizona, right? Florida, Arizona, those are the two places for seniors. We had a lot going on. And so I was a major market manager. And essentially my role was to turn competitors into collaborators, literally. So we helped the senior living communities that used to compete against each other come together under a unified network. So that involved a lot, right? We're launching some new communities. We had to redesign go-to-market strategies, restructure teams. We had to align referral and commission models to support the shared success, right? Instead of, competition. And so that was really my first experience seeing that, the deal is just the beginning. It's, what really matters is what happens after the deal, right? How you integrate and operationalize it. That's what makes or breaks it.
Yeah, and I love this. It's something I've talked about a little bit on the podcast before, is this conversation. I mean, there's so much of what you said, but one of the pieces is this conversation of doing business/deals with your competitors, right? A lot of people, their thing is, oh, their competitors, they're over there. I'm not going to share any information. I'm not going to talk to them. I'm not going to, whatever. And I'm not saying there might be certain industries or certainly certain specific competitors that might, be appropriate in because they're not trustworthy or they're not, open, or they're going to try to steal your data, whatever. But more often than people would think, there are huge opportunities to collaborate with quote unquote competitors, whether that's, actually doing the deal together, whether that's sharing information. I mean, this is a small version of it, but in Entrepreneurs Organization, we have a subgroup for EO lawyers, right? And there are very few truly entrepreneurial lawyers. I mean, lawyers are not known to be entrepreneurs. They might be self-employed, have their own firm, but there's a different mentality to really be creative and innovative and, grow and not just sit and bill your own hours and build a real business. And that's who these folks are. And, nominally, a lot of us, I mean, there are other corporate and M&A and deal attorneys in this group. and we just freely share information, and part of it, is just that we realize the benefit. And I think all of us come much more from an abundance than a scarcity mentality, which is, I think, a big distinction on that. So it's very cool. And I've also worked with some clients where we put together like industry associations. I had Damon Gersh on the podcast a couple of times, a client of mine, where he was in the disaster recovery space. And in order to compete with a few of the national firms, he was a strong regional firm, created an industry association of regional firms so that they could get the bigger contracts. And it turned out to be very successful and helped him increase the value of his company when he eventually sold it. So I love this idea of, looking at competitors differently.
Yeah, totally agree. I think to your point, right, it's about an abundance growth mindset versus a scarcity fixed mindset. And that was so much of what that was, right? Retraining people's brains to think about it differently, right? It's not just this community that I have now, right? I have a whole suite of products and communities that I can pull from. And I think when people finally clicked and you align, obviously, the incentives accordingly, we started to get some movement there.
I love it. And who were, I don't need names or whatever, but like, obviously, you talked about how healthcare industry was sort of by default and what you loved about, this more exciting model. Talk to me a little bit about, and you don't need to name names, but like, obviously somebody, and it sounds like you were on the team there, but there was some leadership that said, hey, because a lot of times I talk about the difference between, there's a lot of data out there on the difference between an employee and an entrepreneur mindset, but there's less on there on the difference between just an entrepreneurial mindset and a deal maker's mindset, right? And there are many companies that just try to grow organically and they don't really, but obviously the leadership team here, I don't know if there's any particular person or people or whatever, said, hey, we want to do this differently, right? And you were a part of that team. And just, anything interesting about that? Like, why did they decide to take this route when many other healthcare companies didn't?
It's really interesting because one of the things that was interesting about this is the company that I was with was actually smaller than the companies that it was acquiring. And so you don't typically see that, right?
Right.
You usually see the big guy come in and swipe up all of the small guys. And this was back in, mid 2000s, right after the kind of the dot-com boom and then the bust. And then we kind of experienced on the tail end of the late 2000s, this recession, right? So these bigger senior living communities, and quite frankly, a lot of companies in general that were larger were kind of over invested, exposed, and you started to see a lot of like Chapter 11 reorganizations. And what was really interesting, actually, just to bring this full circle, one of the companies that we actually acquired, I worked for in college, and I was there during the Chapter 11 reorg. And I was in the finance and admin side. So it was a lot about like budget cuts and what can you do and how can you do more with less. But because they were so big, they couldn't turn fast enough, right? They couldn't pivot fast enough to make the changes that they needed to correct where the business was going, given where the economy was. And so this smaller, more agile company actually, was able to come in and, have the right P&L, have the right vision in place and kind of take down these two behemoths, right? Or absorb these two behemoths in the industry. So I thought that was really interesting because you don't think about that when you think about acquisition. You think big guy coming in, right? Like Goliath coming in to take over David, right?
Yeah, no, you're right. That is totally fascinating. I mean, I've been doing this a long time, so I've seen it occasionally, but it's rare. It really is rare for a number of reasons. But I like that because there is an agility. I mean, people understand that generally. There's a lot of talk about disruption and how new companies come in more on the organic side, but it's also true, on the deal side, right? You can be more agile, and this is a great example of it. Okay, so continue on. So how did you go from that experience to what you're doing now? What's the journey from there?
So after the mergers and acquisitions kind of settled down, right, and it kind of became business as usual, healthcare went back to being healthcare, very corporate, very
And you got bored because I could tell already.
Yeah. Yeah, I was like, "Oh, this isn't fun anymore." And so off I went. When I was doing some research, so I got way more strategic about looking for my next opportunity in this little in between. I was able to have like a little 3-month sabbatical in between and just kind of think about what I want next. And so I started looking at different industries, right? And what I thought about what I loved about the time working in senior living when we were doing the mergers and acquisitions. And what I loved was the growth and the high speed and the figure it out, right? And so I actually pulled up and did research in the most admired companies, like best places to work kind of stuff, right? And I picked 4 to apply to. One of them was, doing really amazing things in and around like women, right, and equality, diversity. Another one was this really like second gen owned construction manufacturing type of firm, but they had just really interesting values and culture. And then the third one was around like tech, right? Technology, software as a service, SaaS. And I immediately got drawn to that. I just thought, wow, there's a lot of new things happening here, and set off to go and work there, or eventually work in SaaS. So I did a couple of, in-betweens, right? I like to call them, I was like, oh, I'm going to get a mind mush job, right? Like I've been running hard, this was when we had Blackberries, right? Like crackberries, right? Like I live and die by this thing. Like I'm just going to get a mind mush job. And so my mind mush job turned into, of course, not a mind mush job. It was in a call center, and I ended up going into quality assurance and operations there. And that was great because they had a really strong culture, and he was like, the classic entrepreneur, right? The classic entrepreneur, thousands of ideas every single minute and all of that. But then eventually the opportunity with the SaaS company came along, and went in there on the marketing side of things. And that was such a great experience. I was with them on their growth journey from just under 300 to almost 800 employees. And during that time, we did 2 really large capital raises, one with Bain and one with Goldman Sachs. Okay. So I wasn't leading the raise. I worked in marketing and sales, and then I moved into like the backside of people and operations. One of the kind of ahas that I had in that moment, this company was really unique. It actually had a value around believing in people and their dreams. So I did a lot of thought, like, what made me so great at sales and marketing? I don't think of myself as a typically very salesy person, right? But I could make a plan and bring a team together and get them really excited about the plan and then go and execute it, right? All really good things for people and operations and processes and systems. And that's where I realized my heart was. So in this company, I returned back to that. And so not being involved in leading the raise, but seeing all of the people and the operations through the post-raise chaos, right? And that's where I really learned, like, you can be messy and you can even have a product that's not the best, but if you have a really clear vision and it's compelling and it's inspiring and you have a strong team that believes in it, like, investors will back you every time. So that really stuck with me, how important the vision is and like the culture as a strategy, right? This was this laser that we could point at most things and have some pretty great results. So I loved that. I would say the other thing that I learned is when you get that much money, right? Hundreds of millions of dollars, sometimes people can get really stupid. Like, you can get really stupid with that money. And unfortunately, there was a little bit of that happened. But yeah, so, definitely the vision piece stuck with me, but also, hey, maybe have a little bit more of a plan as to how you're going to spend that money, or how much of it you should spend, right? Like maybe some of it should be, saved away for a rainy day. But this was like during the SaaS boom, right? Like, the unicorn companies, and, this one's rated at $3 billion. And I mean, it was just kind of a crazy, exciting time,
Yeah, and it's interesting because it is a challenge, and it's still true, right? The whole model, certainly in SaaS, but any kind of VC or PE that company, the model is, hey, we're giving you a bunch of money and we want you to grow fast, right? We want to put fuel on this fire. You have the capital to do it. We want you to deploy the capital, and we're looking for these multiple X returns, right? And I speak to friends and clients who are looking to raise capital, and I'm always like, listen, the whole game's going to change here, right? You have to understand there's going to be pressure to grow. There's going to be pressure to do it quickly, to deploy capital. And obviously in those situations, it's almost inevitable, I think, that there's some money that's spent, and it's not necessarily, obviously to an extreme, it's a problem. but there is sort of a cost of speed, right? And that's the game. So the question is, how do you balance that? How do you make smart capital deployment decisions when you are under pressure to grow super quickly and deploy capital quickly, right? Like even the investors don't want you socking stuff away for a rainy day, really. They want you smartly deploying capital quickly, right? But that's not so
Right.
easier said than done, right?
Right. And I think that that's where the plan and the discipline comes in. And it's a balance, right? Like you know what you have to do, right? In exchange for getting that money, right? Because you made a deal, right? That's a commitment. But I think sometimes the pressure of that, right? It causes companies to make choices that had there not been the pressure there, they probably wouldn't have made. And they're not always the smartest choices.
That's right.
So I think, yeah, that was a really big eye opener for me. And, obviously, venture capital is so different and the relationship there than even like a PE firm investment. And so, yeah, you make these choices in the moment under pressure and urgency. And sometimes that reality doesn't make for the best decision making.
Yeah. Let's take a break from the show for a minute so I can tell you about an incredible resource my team and I have put together for you. Secrets of Deal-Driven Growth, Creative Ways to Grow Your Business Even in Challenging Times, is a powerful ebook that helps you take DealQuest podcast episodes and apply them to your own life and business. This is the ideal tool for anyone looking for creative ways to grow as dealmakers, and you can get yours now. It's as easy as heading to corykupfer.com/workbook and downloading your copy. While you're there, you can also consider joining our dynamic deal-driven community of founders, experts, small business owners, and entrepreneurs. Now back to the show. All right, so how do we come to your company and what you're doing now, and why? I know it's not all you do, but why this focus on the boomer, generation? Give us, let's bring it to where you want today.
The SaaS company I worked for was B2B, which means it served businesses and specifically small to mid-sized businesses. And I really fell in love with entrepreneurship there. I got the opportunity to meet so many of our customers. We had, a big conference every year. As we scaled, it was really important to us from a vision standpoint to make sure as we went out and got this talent, right? I think we hired almost 600 people in 18 months, which was crazy. We wanted them to be able to connect with the purpose of what we were trying to do, right? With small to mid-sized business owners and understanding that struggle, right? And just the amount of faith that they have to take that jump, right? I fell in love with it. I never considered myself entrepreneurial, like in any type of way. My husband now, that's another knack. He can't stop coming up with thoughts and ideas. And I'm like, okay, what's the plan now to get it done? So we make a good balance that way. But I think that entrepreneurs and small business owners, right, they have this incredible ability to build innovation and really change the reality for their communities, right? I think they're like the lifeblood of innovation and they can change their communities and their families indefinitely. And so that always stuck with me. And I feel like it wasn't necessarily a choice, but it's like the universe started bringing me these opportunities, right? Can you help me do this, Georgie? Oh, hey, this person I worked with over here, can you help me do that? And I've said, yeah, why not? Right? I thought it would be great to, have be the owner of my own destiny. And part of that also came from having been in the boardroom, at the leadership table, at the exec table from such a young age, right? And in the positions that I was in, right? You see how the sausage is made, right? And it ain't always pretty. And so there was really an incongruency there with what we crafted in a culture and in a purpose and values and what we said to our employees and our customers. And then when, push came to shove and we were in that, you have to make a decision, a lot of times the back end of that doesn't match up, right? And that was hard for me. That was hard for me to reconcile because as an employee for a business, and maybe not everyone's this way, maybe this is the entrepreneur or the intrapreneur in me, like the ownership mentality. I felt like my values and like who I was, my wagon was hitched to that. And so when decisions were made that were really incongruent, it just didn't sit well with me. And so I think I saw this as an opportunity to feel aligned, right? Because I was going to be in the driver's seat and the universe was giving me the opportunity. So why the heck not, right? And so we started Hire, Train, Inspire back in 2016. So yeah, wow, almost 10 years now. And we help business owners get their companies deal ready. Now, it wasn't always like that. I was like, hey, I want to help small to mid-sized businesses. So my answer was like, yes, what's your question? Yes, what's your question, right? Because that's the discovery phase. But as I got more and more into it, one of the things that I got really passionate about is, these small to mid-sized business owners, they'll reach a point where they're just like stuck, right? And that can be whether they're looking to sell, retire, restructure, or just step out of their day-to-day. And so I come in when a founder says, I'm ready for what's next, but then it really becomes clear that the business isn't, right? The business isn't ready. So that transition is huge. And especially when you look at baby boomers, right? Over 50% of small businesses are owned by boomers right now. And I think there's something like 10 million boomers that are retiring every single day, right? And 60% of those have absolutely no succession plan, like no plan for how to do that. And so there's this, in the next decade, right, there's literally billions of dollars of wealth that have the opportunity to be transferred, right? That is a huge opportunity. And they don't know how, right? They know they want it, but they don't know how to do it. And so I think one of the things that has become really clear is that they'll reach that point, but by the time they reach that point, they're so done, and it's sometimes there's not enough fuel left in the tank to do what they need to do to help them transition without losing what they've built, right? Because they've been spending their lives doing this, 30, 40 years, and they've built something, a legacy, right? With people and values, right? And enterprise value. And sometimes that means prepping for a sale, right? And sometimes the business is not going to be sale ready, or it's going to take too much time between when they want to leave and when it would be sale ready. So a lot of times what happens is, they'll go to a PE firm or wherever with the intention to sell the business. And that PE firm will say, oh, you don't have a business here because it can't run without you, right? Like that's the definition. It can't run without you. So you don't have a business. And that's all great. Go talk to this, this guy over here, this deal guy, right? That's gonna help you. And then they'll go to them and they'll take a look under the hood, right? And be like, oh no, this is a mess. And I have a couple of referral partners and I'm like, all right, go talk to Georgie. So that's what I really enjoy is, helping them walk through that process, right? Whether it's succession planning and bringing in a new operator, other times it's helping them explore ownership transfer options like ESOPs or Popeye plans or an employee ownership structure that allows that business to live on in the hands of the people who help build it.
Yeah. I love that. So we had, why am I trying to blank on his name? We had a guy, an ESOP expert on several months back. I'll see if I can find it real quick. I apologize that I'm not remembering his name, but one of the things that, true ESOPs don't make sense for companies until you reach a certain level, usually in terms of expense and complication and things like that, whatever. But you mentioned some other options, and we've certainly done a lot of internal succession work, just, where the company's sold or equities earned over time or things like that. So talk to me a little bit, more about that because, external sale is one option, but depending upon industry, especially, internal succession is another potential option for certain businesses.
Yeah, definitely. So, and that's the case too for a lot of our founders that we work with. And so what that can look like is, creating governance boards or clarifying org design, installing systems, right? Strengthening the leadership bench so the business is scalable and valuable and sustainable. Because, again, the truth is that most of these businesses aren't ready for a deal when the founder is finally ready to leave. So the work is in closing that gap, right? Making sure the company isn't just profitable, but it can thrive without the founder. So I think, something to keep in mind, and this has struck me especially with the baby boomer clients that we work with, they care very deeply about their people and their legacy, but they're also, as much as they want to let go, they're overwhelmed by the complexity of letting go.
Yes.
And then coming to that the terms with the fact that their business isn't as ready as they thought, right? They've been in it every single day. They've been, trying to operate it. And so when they get to that point, right, they really have, I think, three main roadblocks in why the business isn't deal ready. The first one I would say is the tribal knowledge problem. The system, the process, whatever the magic is, the customer base, but it lives in their head, right?
Yes.
One of the things that's really interesting about the boomer generation versus the generations that came after them, right? Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, is they spent their career building mastery through tenure and loyalty, right? They stay. And that really allows this depth of knowledge that we haven't seen in other generations that maybe only stay at a job for 5 years or 3 years, or with some of the newer generations, maybe 18 months. You can't develop that depth of knowledge when you're skipping around like that, right? But the problem is the knowledge is undocumented. It's invisible, right? And it's critical. And so what they hear is buyers don't want key knowledge walking out post-close, right? They don't, and even people who are not PE firms, just maybe a potential buyer, right? They don't want to buy a job, right? They want to buy a business. And so the tribal knowledge problem is huge. And the work to fix that isn't sexy at all. I mean, it isn't. It's process documentation, right? It's
Yes.
client transition plans. It's role shadowing. It's delegation timelines, right?
All the stuff that visionary founders hate.
Right. And I think it's really interesting because, there's solutions, or there's solutions out there that will sell to these visionary entrepreneurs, right? That, oh, you don't have to do that work, right? You can find somebody to do that. And honestly, I really haven't seen that work, right? The reality of it is they have to put on their big boy, big girl pants, like lace up those boots, and they have to do the work. And that's not always popular. And then they're trying to do that with different generational styles, which adds a whole nother layer of complexity, right? Like Gen X, they're all about lateral growth. Millennials are about systems and values. Gen Z's, high expectations, digital natives, right? So there's an incongruency, there's a disconnect. And that proves to be a really big challenge. But the reality of it is these boomers hold, 30 or 40 years of IP, right? They hold client nuance, decision-making logic all in their heads. And so the only solution is to get it out of their heads.
Yeah.
I think the second biggest thing that they go up against is they might go into this so done, so over it, so ready to go. I'm thinking about a client. I have one-on-ones with her every month, and she's like, oh, I'm so over it. I'm so over it, because she's so ready, right? So they hold on longer than they actually want to because they don't trust anyone else to run it, right? And the reality of that is often they're not wrong. Like, they're not wrong about that, right? I think what they have to do is build confidence through clarity. They need to get clear first before they can help other people get clear. And it's a lot about letting go is a lot about testing and iterating, right?
Right.
Testing the transitions, testing what works, what doesn't. It's also not a all at once thing, right? It's a transformation. It's a phased exit. And then the third and most obvious one is there's no one else to take over, right? They're looking around, there's no one else to take over. I think a lot of my boomer clients too, they envisioned that their kids would want this, right? And then they don't, right? They're off doing their own career or being influencers or whatever, but they don't want the business. That doesn't seem, fun or attractive. I don't want to run a pool business. I don't want to run a plumbing business. And so they're left with no one to take over. And so that's kind of where the succession planning comes. And again, that takes time, right? Successors aren't magically created. They're not born, right? They're built over time. And
Yeah.
so a lot of this stuff, takes years to develop that, right? To develop internal talent, to source external operators, to put in place advisory boards and fractional executives that can create some stability within your business. So those are the three biggest things that I see most often as their issues.
Yeah. And, listen, I mean, anybody who does anything in this space is going to say, you should be starting to think about these things a minimum of 3 to 5 years, minimum, right? Before you want to exit. And practically, I mean, listen, especially founding entrepreneurs, a lot of times it doesn't happen, not because actually 3 to 5 years in advance, they don't really know they want to exit, right? And then, whatever, the economy changes, they have a health issue, they just get exhausted. Their significant other is like, hey, let's travel the world, whatever the trigger is. And now right, they're not ready, right? And they either have to not sell at a significant discount or spend several more years in the business than they really wanted to get up to the point. So how do like, what do you find is the difference between the folks that, do wait too long and now they're like every month saying, oh, I want to be out of this thing. And the folks that actually do the planning in advance, like, who are the smart ones that actually, call Georgie in 5 years in advance, as opposed to, when they want to be done tomorrow.
Yeah. So I think if you've built as you went along, right, it's a little bit easier. And I don't say that to say that everything's going to be buttoned up and beautiful, right? I have 2 clients that I'm wrapping up with right now. And this is one of my favorite deals. So there's both second generation business owners. And their father started the business, ran it for 35 years, and then they split the locations, right? They split into 2. And the brother took one, sister took the other. And it's been really interesting to see the path that each one has taken, because they're both very different, right? The brother, he acquired a couple of companies, so he made, significant growth in that. And the sister, she grew as well, but like through just like blood, sweat, and tears. Her and her husband, they are the business, right? And so I think, I started working with them just under 2 years ago, the brother first, and then the sister came along. But at the time, right, he had an infrastructure, but he was working 55 hours a week. There was no org structure, no leadership bench, right? He had people with a ton of deep knowledge, but when you asked his team the question, who do they report to? It was all to him, right? One to 50, 1 to 50,
Oh, yeah.
which obviously doesn't scale. And we had the intake meeting and I said, what do you want to achieve? Like, what's the goal here, right? And he said, well, my wife is itching to travel. Like, she's like, let's go. And, I maybe, he said, 3 years from now, I can maybe start to step back a little bit. That was his goal. And I said, 3 years, oof, I think she's going to be fed up with you by then. So we got to work, right? We got to work. We started building the leadership bench. We identified the successor, right? We went through solving those 3 problems that I already laid out. And about 14 months in, we met this January. And he said, well, Georgie, I think this is the year. Right? His team didn't need him anymore, right? He went from working 55 hours a week to he was in the office, but not really doing a lot. And then over this, last quarter, we've managed to move him into his beach house, which is way south of where the company is. And he's attending maybe 1 to 2 meetings per week right now, getting ready to follow his wife as she travels around doing activities at resorts, which sounds pretty cool to me. And what was really interesting is as we were going through this, right, sister is over here looking at what brother's doing. And she's like, oh, I want in on that. But she had no infrastructure, right? And the brother had lots of infrastructure. And so what we were able to do is also identify a successor for her, but put into place a shared services model. And so instead of her having to spend years trying to build up a team and build up the infrastructure, anything that could be shared from the ERP, right, system to HR and payroll, marketing, some things in purchasing, some account manager things, because they should have some shared accounts, we combined, right? We combined. And so we started working with the sister about 10 months ago. And she'll probably be done in June. So it doesn't have to take 5 years. We can get creative and create some solutions, right? Now, they were lucky in that they had each other. That's not always the case, but it's definitely better when the more time you have, the better, right? I always ask people to think, you should be thinking about, and this is very counter to a baby boomer's mentality because they don't mind being the backbone, right? They like that. They relish being that. But it's like the hit by the bus mentality, right? If I'm gone tomorrow, what happens, right? Does somebody else know the things that I know? Even if it's spread across the organization, right? Does somebody else know the things that I know? And I think it's never, ever too early to start thinking about that, right? Even from the moment that you start your business. But I've loved it because it's just this freedom, right? And we chose to go with a Popeye plan for them. And we've significantly changed the lives of the people who have dedicated their lives to that company, right? Yeah. Because now over the course of 10 years, they will be owners, right? They will be owners in that. And that's a transfer of wealth, right? That changed their lives and the lives of their family. So
without getting into the minutia of it, just for our listeners who may not understand what that is, can you just quickly explain what a Popeye plan is?
Oh, yeah. So the Popeye plan is basically an approach for business owners. I think it works really well for baby boomers who are looking to retire, exit, but don't, have a clear path forward. What it does is instead of forcing a rush sale or shutting down the business, it bulks up the company with the right leadership, processes, financial readiness to ensure that they can survive and thrive beyond the founder. And so over the course of, it can be different, 5, 10 years. What it's doing is it's allowing the baby boomers to gradually get their money out, right, through the revenue of the company. And then as that transition happens, the ownership group that it's being transferred to over that time will eventually become the owners of the company and merging operations.
Yeah, great. So I have you mentioned the brother and the sister, right? And so it raised something for me because one of my many things I do outside of my law firm is I've been involved with entrepreneurs organization and I run the deals community, we call it Deal Exchange in EO. And I'm actually speaking in Hawaii coming up in the next week at the Global Leadership Conference. But in addition, I'm going to be speaking in Montreal in June. Actually, I think it's just like shortly before this episode's going to air at the EO Women's Conference. And I was invited to speak because, people put together a learning program. I know the woman who heads up that community in EO, and we're on calls together because we run EO communities. I run Deal Exchange, she runs EO Women. And they wanted me to come and speak about deals. And the learning chair for the event said to me, hey, Corey, I just think as women, we don't think in terms of deals the same, as much as men do, right? And listen, any gender conversation, I'll put all the disclaimers up front, right? There's anytime we talk about gender, it's never going to be across the board. There's always differences, et cetera, right? Also, there are people who don't identify as, male or female, right? So all the disclaimers there. But there are trends. I mean, and there are generalizations that are generally true. And like in my negotiating book, I talk about one of the biggest things that I find with women challenge in negotiation is owning their value, because there's so many things in the society that are telling everybody, but even more so women, that they're not enough and whatever, and unless they wear this makeup by whatever, right? And all that stuff. And for men, it's often their ego getting engaged, right? Pride, ego, that kind of stuff. And, in 40 years of doing this, of course, that's not universally true in the two genders, but but way more men screw up negotiations through ego and pride, and way more women, don't do well in negotiations because of not owning the value. So on the deal side, it was interesting, for me that she made that comment. It wasn't surprising. And I said to her, she said, so, I'm interested in the way you're going to approach it. And I said to her, listen, honestly, first of all, when people think about deals, yes, sometimes they think about just PE investments or major mergers and acquisitions, but there's so many other types of deals, strategic alliances and joint ventures, licensing, whatever. And deals are a relationship. The best deals are relationships. And frankly, in general, right, women are much more relational than men. So you all should be better at a lot of these deals than we are. So any case, I know it's a big question. I know we could probably do an entire hour on this. And I'm not saying you're a gender expert, but being a woman in the deal space, I'd be curious as to your take on that in terms of, in general, some of maybe the gender differences on how folks relate to deals.
That is such a big question, and there is so much to unpack there. It honestly starts from, gender conditioning when you're small, right? Like what people are talking to you about or teaching you, what the expectations are from your parents to your school to your workplace, right? It's all kind of baked in there. And so in order to break out of that, right? Because those are norms, right? Those are gender norms. Those exist, right? Those still exist. They're still in and around us everywhere, right? That's a reality. In order to break free of that, right, they have to either, like as a woman, right, you have to either choose differently, right, and go find out, or again, through mentorship or some way like that, right, seeing a different way through your experiences, right? Like myself, had I not had exposure at such a young age to the mergers and acquisitions, like I wouldn't have probably even thought about that, right? I wouldn't have been in that mindset to see the power of that, right? And how that can change things for people. So I think it's there's so much there, right? It's again, gender norms that have to be broken. But to your point, right? If we look at women and just the way that their minds work, right? I always remember one of my one of my psychosocial teachers, did a liberal arts degree because I didn't know what else to do. But they talked about kind of the biology of the brain with men and women. And he described it as, men, there's this 2-lane country road. And with women, there's literally this like multi-ramp, interstate freeway system, right? And I think that's probably the benefit of the relationships because they can see all these different things kind of coming together at once. But it's just not something that is translated, right? We don't realize that until we realize that, right? And until people, somebody comes along and says that maybe. But yeah, I think you can see from people's paths, right? Even now, right? By and large, the PE firms and the deal makers and things like that, I mean, they're male, right? And obviously there's a reason for that because there's some deep-seated norms that have been occurring and happening for years and years all the way back, right? But I think you're right. Like, I mean, that sounds like an exciting thing to go and speak to women about is using, their gifts, right? The things that make them great to have almost like a competitive edge. And that relationship part and that understanding the complexity and all of the dynamics of how those things go together is a huge component of that.
I love that. I appreciate it. I know I threw a huge question at you.
Yeah, no worries.
But it's, it's
Like,
more like I want to get input on it because, obviously I want to provide value at, this thing and, I mean, the gender gap in raising capital. I did an event with actually Deal Exchange and EO Women. We did one together where I interviewed Robbie Hardy, who's fun. Listen, go check out Robbie. She's amazing. She was in corporate America, like 40 years ago as one of the few only executive, launched a tech company in the 90s as a woman-owned founder, raised capital as a woman-owned founder in the 90s. And, and now she teaches women not only how to raise capital, but actually encourages them to be investors. So, so it's there I'm passionate about. Okay, before I ask you my final two questions, Georgie, because we do need to wrap up here, is there anything else, whether it's about the service you provide or trend, things you're seeing in the industry or about boomers or whatever it is that you want to say before I ask you my final two questions?
Yeah, I would say, again, when you're thinking about when you're in a business, you can never ask yourself what my plan is too early, right? And if your business plan has a deal at some point in it, right, understand that it's, there's a pretty clear checklist, right? You go to anybody who's going to buy the business, they're going to probably ask for the same couple of things: clean financials and unit economics, the team, right? The team that can run without you. I always say, can your business run 90 days without you? If not, it's not deal ready. I would say process automation and SOPs, dashboards, right? They want to buy an asset, not a job. And so they want to see transparent dashboards that tell them, is this doing well or not? The roadmap, right? What happens next? What's the plan? Have you thought about that? Is there a roadmap or a blueprint they can follow? And then governance. Governance needs to be in place. So those would be the things.
Love it. So listen, I actually wrote two things just to circle back on. In addition to this event I did with EO, Robbie Hardy was also a guest on this podcast, so you can look up her episode. And then also, I remembered that Kelly Fennell is the person on the ESOPs. So if you want to learn more about the depth on ESOPs and how they work, check out Kelly Fennell's episode. So Georgie, if people want to find out more about you, where do they go?
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn or at my website, hiretraininspire.com. Either of those two places.
Awesome. So, Georgie, my final question on the podcast is about my highest value in life, which is freedom. And for me, that means everything from freedom from oppression for people around the world to why I have been an entrepreneur for decades and haven't had a boss. What does freedom mean to you, and how does it impact your life and business?
I love that you said that. Actually, one of my clients, I call them the longest deal because we're 4 years in and we're still working on it. But that is the number one value for that organization and that founder as well. Yeah, freedom means choice to me. Freedom means choice and opportunity. And that might seem really simple, but it never ceases to amaze me how many people operate their lives as if they don't have a choice. And no matter what, there's always a choice. Now, it could be two really rotten choices that you don't like, but you have choice, right? You still have a choice. I think that's really what it represents to me. And that's what makes humans unique, right? Like we have the ability to discern and consider and think about choices, right? We have an ability to do something outside of our default nature, right? We all have default natures. We all have ways that we go to, and those best show up usually when we're in a stressed out or like high pressure environment. We kind of go back to our true self, but we have the choice to make a different one, right? We can choose differently. I love that concept of freedom. There's so much in there, right? I think the other piece that I see with freedom is the freedom to live in your whole self and truth, right? To really lean into your truth, your whole self. And I like what you said earlier when you were asking the question about the genders, but it kind of went into, all of this dynamics and relationships and all of that. And I realized that, so much of what I do is that it's like living in the gray, right? Working through the gray, because people are wonderfully complex. We have things that are true about all of us, but there are things that, make every single person unique. And I think freedom is meeting people where they are.
Love that. Georgi, thanks for being such a great guest on the DealQuest podcast.
Thank you so much, Corey. I had a blast.
Thank you for joining me on this episode of DealQuest, where we help you understand how deal-driven growth can be your ticket to freedom. If you are interested in finding out more about my law firm, the services we provide to entrepreneurial and growing companies across industries all over the country, and my partner Brian Megan and I, and my amazing team, just head over to cupforlaw.com. That's cupforlaw.com. And if you want to follow more of my content, head over to my LinkedIn page where I post regularly. I'm Corey Kupfer. Until next week, wishing you the freedom and financial prosperity that I know your DealQuest will bring.